It was getting dark when we arrived at the Splendido Hotel, and we received a more than warm welcome. Giacomo's recommendation to the hotel manager was very helpful. We were offered a magnificent room, larger and with a better view. 30 minutes after checking in, a tennis player named Wilhelm called me, saying that he was ready to play at any time, including at night. I was thrilled to have a tennis partner for the duration of our stay. I asked if it was too late to play at 9 o'clock in the evening, and he assured me that this was quite a normal time. "Great," I said. "See you at 9. He said he would reserve the court in my name, and we said goodbye. While we were unpacking, the phone rang again. This time it was Caterina who welcomed us to Portofino and invited us to a party the next evening. I felt confident that our holiday in Italy was going to be fun. Gail came with me to the court, and we met with Wilhelm. I couldn't believe the combination that greeted us. A wide, smiling, blue-eyed man of about 25 or 30 looked like the embodiment of the ideal German gene, handsome, with perfect teeth, with a German name, and at the same time speaking English with a broad Italian accent. Gail and I both laughed. When Wilhelm looked questioningly, I commented, "I look more Italian than you." He simply smiled. I guessed that he had heard this before. We spent over an hour on the court, and he played great. His backhand was a picture of perfection, his white uniform created a classic look, and was a joy to watch. I won, but I knew that Wilhelm was just playing along with me. The three of us sat on the club's terrace, drinking water and talking. Having learned that Gail was also playing, he suggested inviting another partner for her. Before I left, I offered to pay for the game, but he refused. I did not insist, assuming that I would later find out why he was so willing to waste his time on us. We agreed to play the next day, including Gail. The next morning, I answered a few work emails, and then we began our pre-planned travel program. Gail dressed modestly, but clearly with the intention of attracting the attention of anyone who was lucky enough to catch the moment and see between her legs or a glimpse of her breasts. She even noticed that she felt mischievous. I couldn't help but compare Gail's behavior at home and on the trip. How could she be so relaxed when we travel and so reserved, almost prim, when we are at home? The strangest thing is that I liked both of these features of her. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we headed to the tennis courts. William was accompanied by Nicholas, a young man whom I would have guessed to be about 20 years old, with long brown hair and cheeks too rosy for a man. The young man smiled without saying a word as he shook my hand. Gail decided to play alone, and she and Nicholas moved to the opposite court, separated by a green canvas hanging on the fence. During one of the breaks, I looked at them and thought that Gail might be too strong an opponent for Nicholas. When we finished, Wilhelm invited me to play again tomorrow, and then walked down the path to the hotel. I sat with Gail and Nicholas, positioning one of the plastic chairs to Nicholas's left, almost opposite Gail. "Good workout?" I asked, looking at Gail. "Very," she replied, "but I think Nicholas didn't try his best," she added in a teasing tone, smiling. It took him a few moments to realize what she had said, and then he replied defensively, "Oh no, Miss Gail, I tried. You play very well." Gail leaned her head back and took a sip from her water bottle, and at that moment her left leg opened up. Nicholas and I did the same. Both looked. The lighting on the court reflected off her white panties, but wasn't strong enough to see the shadow of what lay underneath. But it was enough to excite the imagination. I wondered what effect this had on the young man. I was also sure that Gail was aware of what we were seeing. We exchanged pleasantries with Nicholas for a few more minutes, then thanked him and stood up to leave. We found Wilhelm still on the path 10 meters from the court, talking to a man his own age. Gail was walking behind me, and I asked him if she could play again. He, speaking directly to her, remarked how surprised he was by her performance and offered to find a stronger player for her tomorrow. Gail, insisting Nicholas was a good fit, said, "I'm only here on holiday, and he's definitely got the ball in play." When we got back to the hotel, we sat in the lobby and ordered 2 Campares and soda. Gail attracted attention, but was immersed in the conversation and did not notice it. "If you want, we can play doubles tennis tomorrow," I suggested. "No," Gail said, "I'm quite comfortable with Nicholas." I thought Gail said that because she knew I preferred single player. She continued, he's playing well enough to give me a workout, and whether you noticed or not, I've lost a few games. You managed to give him an equally good workout, I remarked with a smile, looking her straight in the eyes. She blushed, smiling that look I adore, then she leaned in, as if to share a secret, and whispered, I don't know what's come over me lately. Everything. She trailed off, everything seems exciting. I retorted, you mean everything turns you on, right? Yes, she nodded without making a sound, with a concentrated look on her face. Are you just going to tease this boy, or is this going to lead to something more? I asked. She looked at me for a long time, then, smiling, asked, do you want this to lead to something more? Maybe, if I knew or if I was with you. Gail studied me for a moment, a hint of her smile still visible. He's cute, she added, ending the conversation about Nicholas. Katerina called from the lobby of our hotel at 9 o'clock. When we got off the elevator, she was standing at the opposite end of the hall with a glass in her hand and talking to a gentleman. She raised her hand, beckoning us, and I followed Gail 2 steps behind until we made our way through the hall. Walking past or approaching people sitting in the hall, Gail attracted admiring glances, even stopping the conversation of 2 couples. Gail wore a mid-calf length dress in mid-green and blue with 3 buttons at the top and bottom. The beige silk belt around her thin waist accentuated her figure, hinting at the perfect roundness of her buttocks. She wore brown sandals, and the buttons at the bottom of her dress were undone, allowing her long, bare legs to show off with every step. The top was tight enough to outline her bare breasts. How Gail managed to look so sexy and demure at the same time was a mystery to me. Katerina introduced us to the gentleman she was talking to. It turned out that it was the deputy director of the hotel. We stood around for a while they discussed a mutual friend, and then we set off. Katerina turned towards the coast, and after a short ride began to climb the mountain, winding through narrow streets surrounded by trees and houses behind high walls. We hardly saw the houses ourselves, but for some reason we imagined that they were luxurious. We wound our way through residential areas, and each time the houses became more and more impressive. At one of the intersections, we turned left along a high wall, and the street was filled with parked cars. Gail nodded toward the area and said, there will be a party here. The entrance was a very tall black gate with metal sheets blocking the view of the house inside. When we arrived at the gate, the guard headed towards the car, but Katerina reached into the glove compartment, took out the remote control for opening the garage door, and the gate began to slide apart. Katerina waved to the guard, and Gail remarked, you seem to be on good terms with the host of this party. Katerina smiled. The house belongs to my uncle. My cousin is throwing the party. I noted, there are a lot of cars there. When the gate opened, we began to climb the driveway and the house appeared before us. Wow, I said. We would have to come on horses in armor. The house looked like a small castle. A circular driveway surrounded the central fountain, with 15 to 20 cars parked in every available corner. The driveway was lined with 4-foot-tall bushes, neatly trimmed, creating a perfect natural wall separating the front of the property from the driveway. We passed an Aston Martin parked in the driveway, and I promised myself I'd take a closer look at it later that evening. We entered the house and were dumbfounded by what we saw. It was truly beautiful, classic. Graceful living, Gail commented. I added, certainly tasteful. Katerina led us from room to room. The people we met smiled in greeting, but it seemed that we were looking for the owner. There were about 10 people sitting in the large library, talking, some smoking cigars. Bruno, our host, sat at the edge of the table. Katerina kissed him and introduced Gail and me, speaking in English. I remembered seeing him at a party on a yacht. He thanked us for coming and held Gail's hand a little longer than necessary. We walked around everyone in the room, and when the conversation resumed, it switched from Italian to English. I was amazed by such politeness. Just like that, 10 or more people switched to a foreign language, and more importantly, no one was excluded from the conversation. Everyone continued to communicate. In my environment, most of the group would not be able to continue the conversation in English. The waiter approached us with a tray containing two types of drinks. We chose white wine and Katerina offered to show us the rest of the party. We followed her from room to room. There were small groups of people everywhere. In some rooms, we just looked inside without talking to anyone. In the dining room, there was a long table with a center of carved ice. There were about 50 different dishes, hot and cold, arranged in a buffet style that Gail remarked, "It's too pretty to eat." Towards the back of the house, there was a gym. All the equipment was pushed into a corner. Two double doors were thrown open onto the pool area, and a small group of musicians, surrounded by speakers, played melodic, very Italian music. Two couples were dancing right behind the open doors. 10 or 15 tables for 4 people were scattered throughout the dance area. We went out to the pool, where there were about 20 to 30 people gathered in small groups. The pool was located on the lower level of the two, and the space was more of a garden than a swimming and sunbathing area. Small lights along the paths and an illuminated pool were complemented by half a dozen torches on bamboo sticks. The effect was intimate and very attractive. We stopped at one of the groups, where Katerina introduced us to Patricio. After the greetings, he began asking questions in perfect English about skiing in Chile. While Gail was recommending places to ride, a woman approached us with 2 glasses, one of which she handed to Patricio. He interrupted the conversation and said, "This is Allison," and introduced us to his wife. For some reason, she started talking to me while the others continued to discuss skiing. Allison was an Australian living in Italy, as she put it. She quickly told me how she met Patricio about their apartment near Portofino and that they were planning a trip to Chile and Argentina. Allison was a few inches taller than Gail, a little curvier, with a soft, very feminine manner. I thought she was younger than us. Her long brown hair highlighted her big brown eyes and the most sensual lips I had ever seen. When she spoke, I could not tear myself away from her mouth, almost losing the thread of the conversation. She had a habit of saying certain words with a hint of a lisp, and for some reason it was sexy. Her dress ended just above her knees, the soft material hugged her figure tightly. I would have sworn she wasn't wearing any underwear. Allison talked to me for about 5 minutes, then touched my arm and said, "Your wife is very beautiful." "Thank you, I think so too," I replied. She walked over to Gail, who was talking animatedly with Patricio and 2 other men. Allison put her arm around Girl's waist and quietly said to the group, "There's such a great table of food, let's go inside before the goodies are gone." I walked next to Gail to the buffet. People were already starting to line up on both sides of the table. Allison gave me a plate and let me go ahead. Gail was walking on the other side with Patricio. The buffet was a real feast in itself. Allison had me try tiny balls of buffalo cheese skewered with a peeled mini tomato and a huge leaf of fresh basil, followed by tuna carpaccio. It was all just too much. "I'd better grab a couple of dishes and then come back for the rest," I said, walking towards a small group of chairs in the corner, plate in hand. Allison followed me. People flocked to the nearest chairs, and when we finally left the buffet, all the chairs next to us were already occupied. Gail and Patricio took chairs at an angle to ours, 10 feet away. Eventually, a group of 5 men and 1 girl, dressed like a boy, gathered around Gail and Patricio. One of the men was an older man, tall, with red hair, standing next to the group and not talking. He kept looking at Gail. I thought he looked familiar, but I couldn't remember where I'd seen him. I tried to pay as much attention to Gail as possible, even though I was talking to Allison and the others. Whenever Gail noticed me looking at her, she would smile back. Patricio did most of the talking, and I noticed Allison glancing in their direction from time to time as well. When Katerina passed by the buffet, she came up to us and we started talking. "Gabriella said she would be here in the evening, but she hasn't arrived yet," Katerina noted. I was surprised. "It would be great to see her again," I said and added, "Is she with Giacomo?" Katerina answered somewhat cynically, "Not when she's here." I thought about her words. Giacomo doesn't get along with her family. Katerina smiled, looked at me for a long time, then leaned over and said in a whisper, "He is her family, and she is his niece." It took me a few seconds to process her words, but I decided it was none of my business, so I simply nodded. Allison returned to the buffet and walked over to where Patricio and Gail were sitting. She handed the plate to Patricio, then stood next to him, smiling in greeting to Gail. Katerina invited us to go outside. I looked at Gail until she met my gaze. I nodded, inviting her to join us with a smile. She waited for the right moment, then stood up, smiled at Patricio and, trying not to interrupt the speaker, modestly stepped back. She placed the empty plate on the nearest table, and with this slight tilt her breasts momentarily appeared in profile. The few steps she took to join us were a demonstration of her beauty. Smiling, she walked towards me. Her movements were graceful, with each step her dress opened slightly, showing her legs well above the knees. I noticed that all the buttons at the bottom of her dress were now undone, and that Patricio, Allison, and the older red-haired gentleman were watching her every move. I took Gail's hand, and the three of us walked to the pool. The waiter walked around with new drinks. We all took one, then went to the musicians where a group of people were dancing. We stood leaning on the balustrade that surrounded the top of the pool and watched the dancers. We were 10 or 15 meters from the dance floor. The music was romantic. The garden and greenery around us was beautifully lit. It was a breathtaking view. Most of the tables were occupied, and I noticed that judging by the number of people scattered throughout the house, there were at least 60 people at this party. Patricio and Allison soon appeared on the dance floor. While they were dancing, Patricio laughed a little louder than he should have while talking to his wife, and it seemed to me that he was trying to impress. For some reason, I began to pay attention to this man. It seemed to me that he was about 40, he was half a head shorter than his wife, with a strong physique. I thought he was probably playing sports. His hair was long and curled at the ends, except at the front, where he had a deep, receding hairline. His posture and demeanor made me think he was arrogant. For no apparent reason, I decided that I didn't like him. When he danced close to his wife, he touched her, clearly not embarrassed that others could see it. I realized that Gail was watching them too. Without taking her eyes off, she said, "They continue to dance in the same rhythm, slow, romantic, very civilized for their age," she said. I chuckled in agreement and said, "The only thing romantic here is you." We both drank a lot of wine, and I could feel Gail relaxing. She usually worries too much about people watching. But tonight she was relaxed. We soon left the dance floor and returned to where we were standing earlier. Gail saw the waiter and asked if I wanted another drink. I already felt the effects of the drink and refused. Gail motioned to the waiter, and at that moment Allison came up to me from the dance floor. I haven't seen Patricio. I only noticed an older man with red hair looking in my direction. When Allison came up to me, she asked, "Is Gail gone?" "No," I replied and pointed to Gail, who was returning with a new drink. Both girls smiled at each other, and then Allison asked, "Can I borrow your man for the dance?" Gail nodded. "You're welcome." Allison took my hand and pulled me towards the music. We stepped into the crowd of dancers, and as we began to dance, Allison stood at arm's length and said, "It's a beautiful place, isn't it?" I smiled, "Very much so." "Do they often throw parties like this?" she replied. "Not really. The season is almost over. They are throwing more parties towards the end of the season." She approached me, and soon we were captured by the mood of the music. I tried to keep an eye on Gail, but I lost track of her before the first song was over. Allison was dancing too close. Internally, I wondered about our impudence, but then I thought, we've all been here for almost 2 hours, drinking non-stop. At least for me, my inhibitions were slightly covered. Apparently, Allison had no restrictions. There were people around us, which allowed such movements to go unnoticed. For some reason, I glanced to my left and noticed Patricio standing 4 or 5 meters from the dance floor, looking around for what I assumed was Allison. "I think Patricio is looking for you," I said. She raised her head to look. He could actually see us since we were standing near the only source of light. I turned to my right and saw Gail dancing just a few couples away from us. That's where his gaze was directed. Gail danced, in my opinion, very decently with the older red-haired man. I was worried that Gail might figure out what Allison was doing, so I directed her to the other side of the dance floor. We danced for another 5 minutes. I hope we have a repeat, Allison suggested. I smiled. We started looking for Patricio, but he was nowhere to be seen. I looked around the dance floor, but Gail had disappeared too. Allison headed towards the pool, and I walked towards the house. I went to the buffet area, poured myself a glass of mineral water, and went to look for Gail. I hadn't seen her for about 15 minutes, it seemed to me. People came in and out of the house. I looked into the kitchen, where Katerina was sitting with half a dozen people. They were talking and drinking. She had her back to me, so I turned around and walked back into the hallway, where the couple was getting ready to leave. I followed them outside, and as soon as they crossed the circular courtyard, I turned left and headed towards the Aston Martin. The further I walked from the main entrance to the house, the less light became. I stopped at the right side of the car to look inside and even touched the leather seat. People were walking along the driveway to the house. I thought about getting into the car, but hesitated. More people were coming out. 5 people came out of the main entrance. 3 went down the access road to the gate. I recognized them as some of the people I had seen in the kitchen recently. The rest of the couple turned right and walked towards the cars parked along the other side of the house. I turned my attention back to the Aston Martin and began to lean over to look at the panel when I realized that the couple walking to their car were carrying drinks with them. I focused again on their retreating figures, and my heart almost stopped as I suddenly realized that it was Gail. She walked half a step behind the tall, red-haired man. I watched as they walked along the cars and then turned left, and because of the tall bushes, I could no longer see them. I was completely stunned and just stood there and watched. When reality returned, curiosity or anger, or perhaps both, took over. Circumstances now dictated events, and I looked around the yard, trying to figure out how best to get closer to where they had gone. As casually as possible, I walked around the Aston Martin and crossed the path on the left side of the roundabout. I hid behind some tall bushes until I was about halfway across the driveway and immediately hid behind some bushes on the other side. I was looking at a grassy area with small landscaped areas and many large trees that stretched down towards the wall. The light on the other side of the wall created silhouettes of trees, but at ground level it was dark. From my higher vantage point, I looked around the space, but did not see them. I started walking towards the house, still hiding behind the bushes. I was about 10 meters from the cars parked near the house and was near a large tree. Staying close to the tree, I looked around the yard around me again. About 40 meters away, where the light from the pool was reflected in quite a large amount, I saw a red-haired man leaning on a large tree, almost against the wall. He was facing the tree, facing me, and I could see Gail's hand still holding the glass and part of her shoulder. He stood close to her, but they did not touch each other. They seemed to be talking. I froze in place. Here we go again, I thought. My heart was pounding, my stomach was clenching. Should I call them out? Or should I leave? But I did what I wanted to do. I went back to the exit until I was sure that I could not be seen. Then I started walking down the slope towards the wall. As I approached where I thought they were, I began to climb towards them. I pretty much used the trees in the yard to hide from their view. I stopped when I saw them. I stood in front of their tree to Gail's left. I could see all of Gail. Her back was pressed against the tree, her body turned slightly to the right. They were talking quietly, but I couldn't make out the words. I leaned against a large tree with half of my left side exposed. I was less than 10 meters away from them and about a meter down the slope. I almost didn't care if they saw me. Music from the pool area made the atmosphere romantic, but not for me. He said something and Gail responded loud enough for me to hear. Really? He spoke again, and they both laughed. When she laughed, he touched her. Gail didn't react or even acknowledge the gesture, but I noticed she didn't stop it. He said something again, and she laughed. Gail then picked up the glass and took a sip, then leaned to the left to set the glass down. I didn't move because I thought she could see me. It seemed to me that I was just a step away from them. When she straightened up, she placed both hands on the wood behind her back, as if she didn't want to stain her dress. The red-haired man began to indulge in excess again. My mind screamed, my breath hitched, and I wondered why she didn't stop it. I had to turn away to catch my breath. They had sex. I retreated down the hill until they left the tree and began walking towards the house. As soon as they were out of sight, I ran to the driveway so I could get into the house before they did. I reached the bushes at the entrance just as they rounded the cars. I waited. The red-haired man walked her to the door. They stood outside for a moment, his left hand reaching out of his jacket pocket, and they exchanged words. Then he waited outside for a few more seconds while Gail walked inside. As I waited, I wondered, where were her underwear? When he entered the house, I came out from behind the bushes and walked down the driveway to the house. I headed straight to the kitchen, but the waiters were busy there. I went to the office, which led to the back garden. "Rye," someone called out to me. I turned around as Katerina came down the stairs. "I just told Gail that when you want to leave, just tell me." "Thank you," I replied. "Have you seen Gail?" "Yes, she's in the upstairs bathroom, second door on the left," she smiled. Katerina had already reached the bottom of the stairs and walked past me, lightly touching my arm. I walked up the stairs, wondering what Katerina might know. I waited in the doorway of the large bedroom. Quite some time passed before Gail left the room. She smiled at me. "I'm glad you're back, my love. You left me." When she came up to me, she extended her hand, and we walked towards the stairs together, holding hands. "Let me tell you," she said, "this guy Patricio, he's just relentless. I needed your help." "Sorry," I said. We were halfway down the stairs when she stopped. "Did you enjoy yourself, Allison?" she asked, looking at me with a sly smile. "Just one dance," I said. "I looked for you later, but didn't find you." "Where have you gone?" She didn't answer. We walked to the dance floor, which was now crowded. The musicians performed a very slow romantic Italian song. When they finished, they announced in Italian that they would be playing old hits during their break. I took Gail to the dance floor and hugged her while the sounds of Me and Mrs. Jones filled the night air. She melted into my arms as we swayed and twirled to one gorgeous tune after another. By the time we danced the third dance, I had forgotten about the scene that was tormenting me, and we danced, pressed closely together, sometimes almost without moving. Gail looked at me. "I love it when you hug me like that. It makes me feel protected." "Where are your underwear?" she quietly replied. "It's there." I stroked her again, this time more carefully. There it was. I could feel the top of her panties over her buttocks. I was sure that she was not wearing panties there in the yard, and I was also sure that she did not have anything in her hands. Her lipstick and comb were in my jacket pocket. I wondered how she managed to put her panties back on. We saw Patricio and Allison dancing nearby. I smiled but didn't really want to socialize right now, so we moved to another part of the crowd. We danced for another 10 minutes. The atmosphere was almost fabulous. Trees, a crowd of dancers in the shadows, a starry sky overhead, old songs that everyone knew, new melodies that everyone recognized. We glided smoothly around the dance floor for a few more minutes. Then a group of musicians returned, and for us this broke the magic. We headed towards the pool, and it seemed like people were grouped in pairs in every corner. The scene reminded me of an evening on the top deck of the Gabbiano yacht. "It's time to go back," I said, looking at my watch. "It's already over an hour." "Fine." Gail looked at me and nodded. "Let's see if Katerina is in the house." We headed into the house and soon found Katerina in the office with a group of friends and Allison. Katerina smiled when she saw us. "Ready to go?" she asked. "If you don't mind," I replied. "Not at all," Katerina answered, heading towards me. "Rye, help me for a minute." And she half-seated, pulling me along with him, leaving Gail and Allison standing together. When we were in the hallway, she leaned over to me and said, Allison asked if she and Patricio could take you home. They want to apologize for something." My first reaction was, apologize? For what? Then I added, "Sure, they can take us to the hotel." When I mentioned this to Gail, she simply shrugged, as if the change of plans annoyed her. While we said goodbye and thanked our hosts, Allison went to look for her husband. We waited at the foot of the wide stairs. Gail held my hand and leaned against my shoulder. "I have something interesting for you," she said. I feigned surprise and looked at her. She pulled back a little and we met our gazes, her playful smile emphasizing the mischief in her eyes. "Later," she added. Patricio drove through the winding streets too fast for a man who had been drinking all evening. Gail was sitting very close to me. We made the usual small talk, mostly between Allison and Gail. We stopped at a traffic light on the lower road, not far from the hotel, when Patricio turned to us. He placed his right hand on the back of the seat. The light from the street lamps came through the glass top of the hatch. "Gail," he said in a voice that was too loud, "I want to apologize to you. In a very barbaric way. I'm sorry." Gail looked at me with a question. "Barbaric?" I helped her. "I think he means barbaric." Gail looked at me incredulously at the comparison. She then reached out and patted Patricio on the arm. "It's okay, Patricio, don't worry," she said, imitating the way many Italians like to say. I still didn't understand what he was apologizing for, although it was obvious that he assumed I knew. He invited us to have lunch with them tomorrow. Gail left the decision up to me. Allison added, "You're welcome." I smiled at Allison. Of course that would be nice. As we were getting ready for bed, Gail told me what happened. When we first started dancing, it was fun. During one dance, he became excited. Gail stood in front of the mirror, topless, leaning on the sink, her perfect butt highlighted by the top of her thong. She looked at me, and he wasn't shy about it. At first, this was not a problem. This worried me. He was right in front of me, dancing like a zombie. People could see what he was doing. "I was looking for you. Of course, you were nowhere to be found." I felt that Gail's concern about what others might see really bothered her. She continued, "After a while, he started fidgeting in his trousers. It took me a while to figure it out." Gail now walked up to the bed waving her toothbrush as she recounted what had happened, majestically naked except for her panties. She was usually so collected, and rarely did I see her so animated and angry. She continued, "Finally, when he saw that I was embarrassed, he continued dancing." "Couldn't you have just left?" I asked. "It wasn't that easy. I didn't want to make a scene. He held me tight." Gail's voice became quieter, and then Leo came over. "Who is Leo?" I asked. "Oh," she said too casually, "an old man. Tall, red-haired man." "Yes, I noticed that he was watching you," I said. "Did he help you?" "He must have seen what was happening. He came up to us on the dance floor, just took my right hand, leaned over to Patricio and said something to him, and then led me away." Gail laughed, obviously replaying the scene in her head. It was actually pretty smooth. "Why does it seem to me that I remember him from somewhere?" I asked. Gail, now back in front of the mirror, looked at me. "He was at a party Giacomo in a restaurant in Monaco. Do you remember? He talked to Angelo a lot." I didn't remember, but Gail took my grunt as a sign of agreement. "And what happened next?" I asked, hoping that saving Leo was what Gail wanted to tell me. Gail continued, "We only danced for a few seconds. He apologized for what happened, and when I said I wanted to use the ladies' room, he walked with me to the toilet in the bathhouse. The door was locked and occupied. I waited nearby, raising myself a few inches so I could sit on the cement railing that separated the pool from the sauna house. Leo sat on the edge of a huge cement box with bamboo trees. I sensed the direction the story was going and said, "I bet he had a good look at what's between your legs." Gail giggled. "Yes, it did." Gail then continued to talk about what happened, but it didn't bother me. That he was looking, maybe I even spread my legs a little wider. I thanked him again and said, "Leo, thank you for what you did." "Nothing special," he replied. He told me that the Italian would have caused a big scandal. I said, "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. I didn't know how to thank you." He looked mostly at my legs, occasionally looking under my dress, but now he looked at my face with a wide smile. I asked him what made him so happy. I know how you can thank me, he said. His smile was mischievous, but I let him continue. I asked him, really, and how is this? He looked at my feet again, still smiling, and said, I would like to be surrounded by this beautiful white area. I pretended to be surprised and said, Leo, is it really you too? He raised both hands, palms forward. Sorry, it's my heart speaking, not my head, and making a fist, tapped it on his chest, imitating a heartbeat. At that moment, the door opened. I jumped off the railing and, looking over my shoulder, said, That would be nice. Of course, I told Gail. Why doesn't he wait? I added with a touch of sarcasm. Gail had already finished her usual bedtime routine and was now climbing into bed. Apart from her panties, she was completely naked. The fact that she wasn't wearing a nightgown or a t-shirt spoke volumes in itself. We looked into each other's eyes, both smiling, content in the silence. Do you love me? Gail asked. I replied, forever hooked, then added, What was it you wanted to tell me? Gail whispered with a light breath. Oh yes, I almost forgot. When I went upstairs, before we left, I opened the wrong bedroom door. Katerina was there with another girl and a man. Gail fell silent. I waited for a while before asking, So what? This is all? Gail quietly replied, She was with a girl. We lay in silence for several minutes. I broke the silence. It was quite a free company this evening. I wouldn't be surprised if they changed partners too. I think that's what Allison and Patricio planned or still want. Yes, Gail agreed in a whisper. Phillies left us a message that they would be arriving the day after tomorrow, she said, then continued, Do you think Allison is attractive? Yes, she is attractive. Gail insisted, Would you like it? I'd like anyone who does that, I replied. We made love. Is there anything you still don't feel comfortable doing with me? I asked. She turned her head slightly to indicate no, then replied, I don't think so. Why do you ask? Just thinking out loud, I replied. There must be a lot of things we haven't tried together yet. Like what? She asked, insisting. I didn't answer, and she continued, still in a whisper, What are you talking about? I always thought we were pretty open to experimentation. After a short pause, she added, Are you talking about me doing something to a girl? No, I answered. You know it's never been a problem for me. Gail suggested, If I were ever interested in a girl, it would be someone like Gabriella. She then added, By the way, she likes girls, you know. I delayed my answer, trying to hide my surprise and not wanting to scare Gail away from further conversation. How did you know that she likes girls? After a pause, she replied, Oh, I just heard someone say that. Katerina said that, I asked. No, Gail whispered. After a short pause, she realized that I was waiting for her to tell me how she heard it. It said Giacomo, she whispered. We hadn't talked much about him since she told me about their affair, and she still didn't know that I was spying on them. I thought it might have been an unguarded moment, and she could have been more open. Did he ask you to be with her? I asked. No, she replied. After a short pause, I continued, Do you remember why he mentioned that? Gail sighed, and I felt her breath. She continued, I said I think Gabriella is so beautiful. Why does he want to be with me? I interrupted her before she could finish. I keep telling you, honey. It's your gentle beauty, your innate sexuality. This combination makes you irresistible. I like it when you think that way, she said. About 30 seconds passed before I said quietly, Then why can't you be honest with me? In a quiet, worried voice, she whispered, Oh, Rye, are you talking about Giacomo? I know it's not fair to you. I never plan these things, but when they happen, I guess part of the excitement is the spontaneity. I always plan to tell you, but somehow it turns out that everything comes out slowly. Even when I enjoy it, I hate myself for not being more perfect for you. I know you like it when I tell you about what I do, but I was really scared when you saw me with Peter. The thought of you watching scares me. I'm afraid you'll hate me. How can I hate you? I answered simply, but I was sure that this did little to ease her doubts. We spent a relaxing morning at the hotel, spending about an hour on the narrow strip by the pool. It was sunny, but the water was too cool, so we mostly talked. We remembered the bet I had won that she had to be honest with me, and how well she had kept our agreement. I didn't want to bring up a specific topic, but I said that I thought she was going astray, and to my surprise, she agreed. I decided a long time ago that there was no need to impose any restrictions on Gail. She was already overly restrained. When we were at home, it sometimes turned into torture. She constantly asked questions like, "What if?" which actually kept us from flirting with others in any way. I realized that it was impossible to push her at home. Here, on vacation, I decided that she could not be stopped. "It's different here," she said. "I just feel like fun is taken for granted here." I commented, "Yes, or at least he is not judged critically." Gail nodded in agreement. I continued, "Then, why do you think I can't share with you?" She looked at me with sympathy. "I share. A little. I think I'm always afraid that you will think worse of me, and also." She hesitated for a long time, then barely whispered, "It's much more exciting when no one knows." Over the past few days, Gail has told me snippets of her affair with Giacomo. I was glad that her story matched what I had seen. I still hadn't admitted to her that I had been spying on them, and I felt guilty that she was honest and I was hiding my misdeeds. Then, perhaps out of guilt or anger, I decided to tell her about past spying incidents. "You know, love, I saw you making love to Werner." Gail turned to me. She literally turned pale. Her gaze was stern, focused, and I knew that her mind was working feverishly. As her cheeks began to color again, her lower lip trembled. I regretted mentioning this. Gail whispered, "So long ago. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I reached for her hand. It was cold. "So as not to hurt you," I replied. "Can you keep a secret from me for that long?" Gail asked. I pretended to smile while looking at her, but my heart was heavy and I didn't comment. I wanted to ask the same question, but restrained myself. I hoped I didn't offend her. Why did I open my mouth? I wondered to myself. Her wet eyes were full of questions. Her cheeks were flushed. I couldn't tell if she was embarrassed or angry. And from some depth of my mind, a statement from a famous writer surfaced. I never got into trouble for what I didn't say. As midday approached, we headed back to our room to get ready for lunch with Patricio and Allison. Gail may have had a bad experience with Patricio, but she clearly wasn't worried about how to dress for this dinner. She looked absolutely gorgeous. She was wearing loose yellow shorts that could pass for a short skirt when she stood. Her collarless jersey shirt had a deep V-neck at the front. I asked, "Are you wearing a bra?" She replied, "No, do you think we should?" I tried to put on a stern face and said, "I like it better when you're without. I'm here to protect you." We were waiting in the lobby when Patricio arrived. He was alone. He shook hands first with Gail and then with me. "Is Allison joining us?" I asked. "She's making lunch," he replied, and we headed out. At an opportune moment, I exchanged glances with Gail. She looked as puzzled as I did, but we didn't ask Patricio. Less than 10 minutes later, we were taking the elevator to the 3-story building near the sea where their apartment was located. The apartment was the epitome of relaxed living. Allison greeted us in a flowy dress that left nothing to the imagination, and I realized that women are intuitive in a way that men will never understand. Gail dressed brightly, intuitively feeling that she had to compete with Allison, and they really competed. There was a young man in the apartment, identified as Allison's brother. She invited me to play tennis with him while we were in Viareggio. He was about 25 years old, and it turned out that he was a real fan of skiing, and we talked about Bariloche. Patricio was proud of his apartment and insisted that I look around it all. The apartment was impressive without being ostentatious, and for me it was a good representation of the modern Mediterranean lifestyle. The food. We thought it was Allison's doing, but it turns out Patricio's mother was in the kitchen, and she had real talent. Then we sat in the living room, looking at the sea from the balcony. Patricio asked me, "What do you do?" I explained briefly. It turned out that he knew about our trip with Giacomo, and also thought that I was somehow connected with business with him. We all drank too much. Gail was relaxed. Both girls were flirtatious, showing their legs every now and then, sometimes showing a glimpse of their panties, and the men enjoyed this spectacle. If there was any tension, it was gone by the time we left. They promised to call. I said I'd play tennis with Vincenzo, and Allison joined us on the way back to the hotel, the girls in the back seat. When we returned to our room, a message was waiting for us that our friends Phillies and Peter had arrived. I immediately called and chatted with Peter. I was going to play tennis, Gail and Phillies were going to meet in the hall, and then we all agreed to meet in the bar at 7 o'clock for an aperitif and then for dinner. Gail's tennis partner, Nicholas, was disappointed she didn't show up. I had a good hour and a half training session with Wilhelm. He made me run from side to side until after one hit I teased him. "Are you preparing me for the tournament?" When I returned to our room, Gail was still missing. I jumped into the shower and directed the hot stream of water onto my right shoulder, which was sore from pitching. Just as I was getting out of the shower, Gail returned, all beaming and smiling, holding a small package in her hands, a gift from Phillies. "We spent the last 2 hours in the lobby," she said, going into the small room to use the restroom but continuing to say, "The manager who Giacomo introduced you stopped to talk to me. He knew my name and asked if everything was okay." "That's professional of him," I added. When we ordered drinks, the waiter said that our drinks were at the expense of the hotel. "It's nice," I said, adding, Giacomo must have been a big influence." I heard "Emichim" from Gail, and then she flushed the toilet. "Nicholas missed you," I said. "I signed you up for tomorrow if you want to play." Gail asked, "Did you play well?" "Very. He drove me from one side to the other in games of 15-20 hits." I continued, "Did Phillies tell you how long they plan to stay?" "Not really. We talked about women's affairs, fashion and shopping, and how to fight off guys." "Oh," was all I said questioningly, hoping she would continue. When we arrived in the hall, there was no one there. 10 minutes later, there were 10 guys sitting there, drinking and looking at us. I think they heard us speak English. "Can't blame them," I said. Gail continued, "Yes, after a while we started to have fun, talk to a man." I began, "These shorts sure make teasing easier." Gail just looked at me and smiled. We took our time getting ready for dinner. I put on a jacket and tie, and Gail put on a simple dark burgundy-purple dress. I looked at the back of her dress and thought I hadn't seen it before, so I asked where she bought it. "In Santiago, in a small store opposite Fendi." I commented, "Don't you think this dress is a little serious for tonight?" She didn't answer, just leaned over slightly, and then slowly straightened up and turned around. The dress covered her shoulders, but not particularly low. It fit her waist like a glove and flowed smoothly over her hips, highlighting the perfect shape of her body. There was a slit in the front that went down to the middle of her thigh. When she moved, I could see 3/4 of her leg. She bent over slightly, and the top of the dress left a small gap between her breasts and the dress, enough for me to know that in the right position I would be able to see her breasts. On her chest was a small gold brooch and no other jewelry. Her hair was tied up, and her dark dress contrasted with her delicate neck. She looked like a work of art, and I was bursting with pride. Phillies and Peter were waiting for us in the hall. Peter looked very elegant in a dark blue double-breasted jacket with gray trousers. His neckerchief gave him the right amount of grace, his gray hair at the temples, his dark skin color, and, most importantly, his posture created a perfect impression. To me, he was what a movie star should look like. Phillies looked dreamy in a green dress that showed off her breasts above her curvaceous figure and gold high heels that showed off her perfect legs. We walked into the bar, girls in front, and heads turned. Peter leaned over to me and said, "It's like déjà vu. Wherever we go with these girls, the room goes silent." Some of the men stopped talking and watched the girls as they sat down. We ordered drinks and spent the next hour discussing what we'd been up to in recent weeks. Our interest in each other seemed to be focused on our time on the Côte d'Azur, and we limited our questions and conversations to these events. Of course, among the questions Peter asked was whether we had heard anything from Giacomo. I thought out loud. It amazes me how much of an impact meeting Tamara had on us. I then explained to Peter that Tamara was the old woman we met in Cannes. Everybody's talking about Giacomo. Our old friends are interested or impressed. All our new friends are from his circle. I wonder where this will lead. Peter replied, "It doesn't go anywhere. It only lasts as long as people think you have access. He is a powerful man, and you feel like you can get closer to that power. Interest is directed at him, through you, and not at you and him." Peter then laughed. "Except for us, we're just interested in you." I couldn't believe Gail and I were still drinking. We started at lunchtime and were already ordering a second round before heading out to dinner. When it was time for dinner, we headed down to the lounge and got into a Mercedes taxi, both girls and I in the back seat. Peter, as usual, chose the right restaurant da Puni, which was the perfect combination of excellent food and relaxed formality. We started with a cool orvieto with antipasto and moved on to burgundy with the main course. The food was delicate and perfectly portioned. It was nice to finish dinner without feeling too full. Peter had such respect for red wine that I asked him about it and learned that he had chosen a collection wine. We were relaxed, enjoying each other's company, and Peter and I were making fun of the girls about the attention they were getting. The waiters circled, hoping to catch a glimpse of breasts as the girls leaned over or moved. Phyllis and Gail did not disappoint them. Halfway through dinner, the girls decided to go to the ladies' room, and a commotion immediately broke out around them, with arms outstretched to help them out of their chairs. I stood up as the girls began to rise, and I watched as Gail turned in her chair, and to the amusement of the two waiters standing nearby, she opened her legs slightly, paused for a moment, and then stood up and walked away. The evening continued at the disco, which was recommended to us by the concierge of the Splendido Hotel. We were lucky to find a table at the edge of the dance floor, a small booth large enough for three, with armchairs on either side and a low rectangular table, like a living room coffee table. Sitting in a booth or in a chair to the right of the table provided a close view of the dance floor, and the dancers provided us with an interesting and ever-changing scenario for the entire evening. Peter and Phyllis hit the dance floor, and I sat next to Gail in the booth seat. We sat, sipped drinks, not talking, watching the dancers. When the slow romantic song started, Gail said, "Let's go dancing." And we walked, holding hands, to the center of the dance floor. As we started dancing, Gail stumbled slightly. I supported her. "Are you okay?" She pressed herself close to me and said, "Hardly, I think I'm getting drunk," and giggled softly in my ear. The music changed, but we continued to dance in the same rhythm, probably not in time with the music, but we didn't care. When we returned to the table about 10 minutes later, Peter and Phyllis were sitting in a booth. Phyllis stood up and asked Gail if she would like to join her in the ladies' room. Gail refused, and when Phyllis left, Gail moved closer to Peter in the booth. As she sat down, Peter smiled at her and asked, "Can you do that again?" The moment Gail sat down in the booth, she had to spread her legs slightly and her dress rode up high. Combined with the front slit, Peter and I got a very enticing view of my lady's inner thigh. Gail smiled, not at all embarrassed. We continued to watch the dancing people, some of whom were demonstrating their skills in front of our table, others were immersed in the dance, as if floating on the dance floor, and others were trying to hide their games. Phyllis returned with a man who followed her. She leaned over the table, giving Gail and me a view of most of her breasts, then turned to Peter and said, "This is Aldo, he asked me to dance," and with a flirtatious smile added, "Do you mind?" Peter stood up, offered his hand to the surprised young man, then gestured with both hands that he was allowed to dance with Phyllis. Peter commented, "She drank just enough to get herself going." As we continued to watch, Phyllis disappeared. After 5 minutes, Peter looked at Gail. "I have to dance with you, Gail." She simply smiled, as if agreeing. Peter continued, "We'll wait until Phyllis gets back. I can't leave Ryan alone." "Don't lose your turn because of me," I told Peter. "I'm surrounded by people." Gail seemed focused on her drink and the dancers, not paying attention to our conversation. "It's okay," said Peter. "We'll wait." When Phillies returned, Peter and Gail got up to go dancing, and Phillies joined me. "Wow," she said. He was excited. I took the hint. "That's what you do to men, my dear." "Do I excite you?" she asked, looking intently into my eyes. "I wouldn't be human if you didn't excite me." "I hope you can show me this later," she added. After a few minutes of watching the dancers, I asked Phillies to dance. "I thought you'd never ask, love," she said. When we hit the dance floor, she turned to me and literally melted in my arms. All my senses were heightened. "Oh my God, Phillies, I forgot how wonderful you feel." At some point, I saw Peter dancing with Gail. We danced for maybe 10 minutes, and then there was a break. Peter found himself in the middle of the two girls, and I sat on the chair. I quietly commented only to Gail, "You and Peter look like you just woke up." Gail smiled and took my hand under the table. After a few moments, Gail reached for her purse, excused herself, and headed to the ladies' room. She returned just as the music started again, and after a few more moments Aldo appeared again, this time with a friend. Aldo asked Phillies to dance and looked to Peter for approval, which he received. His friend, speaking perfect English, asked Gail to dance. She looked at me and whispered, "I don't want to dance again." I nodded and raised both hands as if to apologize. "Sorry, but thank you." The young man was very polite and even bowed slightly as he retreated. "Oh my God," Gail commented. "Did you see this?" I replied. "I saw. Quite politely, don't you think?" "Very," Gail agreed, looking in the direction where the young man had gone, clearly thinking better of him. Peter looked a little animated and leaned forward, rubbing his hands. "It looks like it's morning. I think we should go," he said, adding, "Anyone want a last drink?" Gail and I declined, continuing to sip our last drink. Peter waved to the waiter and motioned for more, and returned a few minutes later with the check. We waited a few more minutes for Phillies to return and then left. In the taxi back to the hotel, Phillies remarked, "I could dance with Aldo all night. He reminds me of Peter 10 years ago." We all laughed and Peter turned from the front seat and said, "We realized his Italian side was showing when you danced with him on the other side." Phillies added, "Yes, I tried to get him on your side to make you jealous, but he didn't budge." Peter joked, "You didn't need to direct him. I was jealous without even seeing you." "No chance, my love," she added. When we arrived at the hotel, it somehow happened that, without making any arrangements, we headed to Peter and Phillies' room. I was surprised that they had a two-room suite, and there was a tall bottle of champagne on the living room table with a waiter's towel neatly wrapped around it. Peter turned on the small radio. Gail sat on the love seat, listening to our conversation but not saying anything. This was a sure sign that she had drunk more than enough. I was half sitting on the arm of the three-seater sofa opposite Gail. Phillies was sitting at the other end of the sofa, and Peter was standing at the table. "A tall, cool drink for the night before we go to bed?" asked Peter. He looked at Gail. She replied, "I'm already stumbling over words, but I can handle one more." Phillies chimed in, "We can dance too," and she headed to the radio on the nightstand. Glasses in hand, Peter raised his glass. "Here's to a wonderful night with friends." We all went nuts. Phillies took a sip and then raised her glass again. "And to all the Aldos in this world." Peter added, "Let them keep coming into our lives." Peter chuckled. I looked at Gail, and she was blushing slightly but still smiling. But I saw that she was thinking about Phillies' words. I raised my glass. "To Phillies, the gentle mediator," I said. Phillies turned to me. She had seemed a little drunk before, but it wasn't so obvious now. Her eyes glared at me. Peter's glass was still raised, frozen in the moment. "You know, Phillies said, "that's one of the nicest things you could say." She got up from the sofa, came up to me, bowed her head, and kissed me. Gail watched what was happening, not smiling or frowning, just watching. Her feet were flat on the floor, and her legs were slightly spread. The slit in her dress allowed me to see her thighs, but I couldn't see her underwear and wondered if she was wearing black panties or no panties at all. Our conversation continued, focusing on the shops and restaurants Peter and Phyllis had found over the summer months. At some point, we were talking about who is more polite, Europeans or Americans, and as a comparison, we mentioned Aldo again. Phyllis said, "He asked me if you were a movie star." Peter and I looked at Gail, but Phyllis clarified, "He asked about you, Peter." Gail and I smiled as we looked at Peter. "Why not? I can understand why he asked." Peter asked, "And what did you answer?" Phyllis, smiling widely, said, "At first I laughed, and then I said that you are the best actor." Gail laughed and nearly dropped her glass of champagne. Peter stood up and walked over to Phyllis with feigned anger and wrapped his big arms around her. Peter commented, "Well, it was obvious where his interests lay." "Oh, let me tell you," Phyllis added. "We hadn't even taken 3 steps before he was already excited." Peter stated, shaking his head, "You're incorrigible," then added, "And that's why I love you." Phyllis looked at Peter, then turned her body and leaned in to kiss him. It all started as a short kiss. I stood up and took a few steps to sit next to Gail. She turned slightly and leaned her back against me. We both watched Phyllis and Peter, and at least I was very excited by what I saw. We all had sex. We didn't say goodbye when we left. When we returned to our room, Gail was sprawled out on the bed on her stomach. I ran a bath for her and found a bottle of bath oil on the bathroom shelf and poured it into the water. I returned to the bed and lay down next to her, waiting for the bath to fill. I brought my face close to hers and whispered, "Are you okay?" She managed a smile. "I'm fine," she said. "I think I'm a little drunk." "Me too," I said, placing my hand on her neck, adding, "I love you, darling." Her smile widened. "Okay." The next morning, I didn't answer the phone. We ordered breakfast to our room and then went back to bed. We woke up, hugged, and talked. When I finally had the courage to talk about last night, I asked, "Did Peter and Phyllis plan something with you last night?" She looked at me with bewilderment. "No, as far as I remember." I paused for half a minute. "Why did you take off your panties for Peter?" Gail didn't answer. "Honestly, I don't remember why." "Did he ask you?" "Yes, when we danced. He said he doesn't understand how girls can tolerate things. I said that we usually don't notice them. When he asked if it was more comfortable without them, I answered yes. Then he asked to take them off. I laughed and agreed. When we got off the dance floor, he reminded me and I took them off." I continued to question Gail. "I thought you weren't going to be with Peter again?" Gail replied, "I didn't mean to. But when you started with Phillies, I thought that's what you wanted." I was stunned by her simple answer, trying to weave my suspicions into the situation. Peter called again around noon. "We agreed to have lunch at 2, right?" "Yes," I said, "we will." "Fine. We leave this evening around 6. Then he added, "Is everything okay?" "We're fine," I replied, although that wasn't entirely true. The dinner passed in a calm atmosphere, more mechanical than emotional. Gail didn't feel any betrayal from the night before, so her reaction was friendly. I had different feelings, which I'm sure Peter noticed. We said goodbye in the hotel lobby. Phillies suggested that we meet Gail when we returned via Monte Carlo on our way to Nice at the end of our holiday. "I don't know our exact schedule," Gail answered truthfully and looked in my direction. Phillies looked at me and asked, "So what?" "I'll look at our schedule," I said. "I have your numbers. If possible, we'll contact you." The next evening, a surprise awaited us, a call from Giacomo. "Enjoying Portofino?" he asked. "That would be an understatement," I replied. "Do you and Gail have time for lunch tomorrow with us and Gabriella?" he asked. "Of course we will," I answered immediately, without even thinking to ask Gail. "How's Gail?" he asked. The pause must have seemed suspicious to him, so he added, "I heard she got into trouble at a party." "No, nothing worth mentioning," I said. "I'm glad to hear that," he responded, sounding sincere. Then see you tomorrow at your hotel at once. See you at 1, I said, and we ended the conversation. We met Giacomo and Gabriella as old friends, and they seemed no less glad to see us. Lunch took place at our hotel, and as usual, when Giacomo was nearby, we received a lot of attention. After lunch, they were preparing to take a helicopter to the inland town of Portofino for the opening of a new hotel. Before finishing lunch, Giacomo gave me the letter. This is our itinerary for December in Buenos Aires. We'd love for you to join us if you can. I looked at the dates. I'll definitely try to arrange it, I said, since December was not usually busy with business trips. I'll let you know a week after I return. Gabriella and Gail had been watching our conversation since Giacomo gave me the letter. That would be great, he added. Giacomo then stood up and said, "Excuse me for a moment, I want to say hello to my friends," and walked to the table on the other side of the dining room, where sat an elderly couple we saw at the hotel almost every day. Gabriella smiled at me. "You get along well with Giacomo," she said affirmatively. "I hope so," I replied. "You treat him the way he wants, so he feels comfortable with you." I just nodded and wondered if she knew the whole story. The remaining days in Portofino, we played tennis, visited shipyards, visited the church of San Lorenzo, swam in the cold but beautiful bay of Perugia, went to Santa Margherita, and made love every day, sometimes twice. One day Gail asked, "How old do you think Nicholas is?" 20, I said, although Wilhelm had already told me. Gail replied, "Yes, it is." Then she added, "But he acts like he's 15 in front of me." I didn't answer. Gail continued, "Do you mind if I invite Nicholas to our room while you play?" I smiled and looked at her, but again did not answer. "I think it would be fun." She hesitated, searching for words. "To play with him." I was still smiling and asked with slight disapproval, "Do you think this is reasonable?" "I think it can be done in a way that isn't too obvious, if that's what you mean," Gail said. "That's exactly what I mean," I replied, nodding slightly and adding, "Okay, do it." As the days began to end, we regretted that we had to leave. Our stay here was a real pleasure, but we both agreed that we still liked the French Riviera better. Gail played tennis every day with Nicholas, but she always left with me. I thought she had changed her mind about inviting him. On the last day we played tennis, Gail played for about half an hour, then left. I finished my hour and a half and took 10 minutes to thank Wilhelm and give him a small gift. I left the court without thinking to check where Nicholas was. When I returned to the room, Gail was in a short terry robe. She had already taken a shower, and her hair was still wet. She sat down opposite me while I took off my tennis shoes. "Did you have a good last match?" "Great," I said, looking at her. Her legs were crossed, but her robe fell open slightly. "I had a good time too," she added, looking at me with a playful smile. I still didn't understand what she was talking about. "Did you defeat him right away that you ended the game so quickly?" "I just wanted to get back first," she said, clearly checking to see if I was being too oblivious. "Oh," I exclaimed. "Did you invite Nicholas?" Gail nodded, yes, still smiling, without adding anything to it. "So how did it go?" I asked. Gail stood up, walked over to me, and sat on my lap, and she whispered, "Yes, my dear, I will tell you everything, but not today." I leaned back, still smiling. "It's not fair. Why not? Better tell me when." "Tomorrow," Gail said quickly, shaking her head as if stubborn. "But we're leaving tomorrow," I reminded. Gail's smile widened. "Yes, love, and it's going to be a fun flight." Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next